There's an island sitting in the middle of the Baltic Sea that Russia can't ignore anymore. Not because it's huge, not because it's heavily populated, but because of where it is, Gotland. If you drop a pin on a map right between Sweden, the Baltic states, and Russia's Kaliningrad enclave, you land almost exactly on it. And that's the problem, because anything that moves through the central Baltic moves past Gotland. Shipping, aircraft, military traffic, everything. Now, for decades, that didn't really matter. Sweden was neutral, not kind of neutral, not leaning west. Neutral, neutral. The kind of neutral that survives 2 world wars, the Cold War, and still manages to act like none of it is their problem. You could have NATO on one side, the Soviet Union on the other, and Sweden sitting in the middle like, yeah, we'll just stay out of it, thanks. And for a long time, that worked. Gotland stayed quiet, underdeveloped militarily, lightly defended, almost forgotten. At one point in the early 2000s, Sweden even pulled most of its permanent military presence off the island. No tanks, no serious ground force, barely anything that looked like a deterrent. Because the assumption was simple, no one's coming. And if no one's coming, why prepare? That assumption didn't survive 2014. When Russia took Crimea, something changed in Stockholm, not publicly at first, not dramatically, but internally, the map started to look different.
Sweden would not be caught off guard. That's according to Defence Minister Peter Hultqvist, who dispatched 10 army tanks and dozens of armed soldiers in Visby harbour on Gotland Island.
Gotland wasn't just an island anymore. It was a gap, a piece of territory sitting in the exact place where, if you controlled it, you could influence everything moving across the Baltic. And more importantly, if someone else controlled it, you couldn't. Now fast forward to 2022, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And whatever was left of Sweden's old mindset disappeared overnight because this wasn't ambiguity anymore. This wasn't gray zone pressure or little green men. This was open, conventional war in Europe. And Sweden did something it hadn't done in over 200 years. It picked a side, not slowly, not cautiously, decisively. By March 2024, Sweden officially joined NATO. And on paper, that sounds like a bureaucratic change, a signature, a ceremony, a flag outside NATO headquarters. But in reality, it was something much bigger. Because Sweden didn't just join NATO, it changed the map. Before Sweden joined, the Baltic Sea was complicated for NATO. You had Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania exposed on one side, Poland holding the southern edge, Finland up north after 2023. But there was still space, still movement, still uncertainty. Now, that space is gone. That space is gone. Because Sweden sits right in the middle of it. Geographically, it connects everything. Norway, Finland, Denmark, the Baltic states, and right at the center of that network is Gotland. Which means something very simple. The Baltic Sea isn't just contested anymore, it's watched from above, from below, across the surface. And Russia knows it, because from Kaliningrad, every movement west now exists under a layer of observation that didn't used to be there. Aircraft leaving air bases tracked, naval vessels moving out tracked, patterns of movement studied, not hypothetically, continuously. And Gotland is a big part of that, because unlike a ship, it doesn't move. Unlike an aircraft, it doesn't rotate out. It's always there, an unsinkable platform, sitting in the middle of one of Russia's most important operating areas. And Sweden has started treating it that way. The Gotland Regiment, P-18, is back. Not symbolic, not ceremonial, real. Around 400 personnel already on the island, Leopard tanks, CV-90 infantry fighting vehicles, and that's just the beginning. Because the plan isn't to keep it small, it's to scale into a force of over 4,000 troops, with integrated air defense, reinforced logistics, full operational capability, a permanent presence. Which means in any future Baltic scenario, Gotland isn't a question mark anymore. It's already occupied, already defended, already in play, and that matters more than most people realize. Because military conflicts in this region don't start slowly. There's no long buildup, no months of warning. If something happens, it happens fast. Which means whoever is already in position wins the first phase. And often, the first phase decides everything. Now imagine you're sitting in Moscow, looking at that map. What used to be a neutral buffer that is now a NATO forward position. What used to be empty is now reinforced. What used to be uncertain is now predictable. And that's the real shift. Sweden didn't just add forces, it removed ambiguity. And Russia has always operated best in ambiguity. Unclear lines, delayed responses, confusion that buys time. That space is shrinking fast because Sweden's position now is very clear. Its own foreign policy describes Russia's actions in Ukraine as illegal, unprovoked, and indefensible. Not vague language, not diplomatic wording, direct, and more importantly, backed by action. Because Sweden isn't just defending itself anymore. It's part of a system designed to constrain Russia's ability to act in the entire region, which means every move Moscow makes in the Baltic is now made under tighter conditions. More visibility, more risk, less freedom. And here's where it gets uncomfortable, because Russia didn't want this. The entire strategy over the last decade was about pushing NATO away, reducing its presence, creating space. Instead, it got the opposite. Finland joined, Sweden joined, and the Baltic Sea is starting to look less like open water and more like a NATO-controlled environment. You'll sometimes hear analysts say, the Baltic is becoming a NATO lake. And from Moscow's perspective, that's not analysis, that's a problem. But here's where the situation shifts, because everything we've talked about so far comes from one direction: Russia. Military pressure, geography, control of movement. But Sweden isn't just creating problems in the Baltic. At the exact same time, it's creating friction somewhere else entirely. Not with tanks, not with ships, with something much quieter, much less visible, and in some ways, much more dangerous. Because while Sweden was turning Gotland into a fortress, it was also making a decision that hit a completely different kind of power: China. And unlike Russia, China doesn't operate in the Baltic. It operates inside systems, infrastructure, technology, markets, which means the next part of this story isn't about territory, it's about control of networks. And Sweden just made itself a very inconvenient country to deal with. If Gotland is the piece of land that makes Moscow nervous, Sweden's telecom policy is the part that irritates Beijing, because Sweden didn't just turn into a military obstacle. It also turned into one of those maddening little countries that looks at a global superpower, reads the security brief, straightens its tie, and says no. Politely, of course, very politely. The kind of no delivered by a Scandinavian regulator with a PDF, a neutral facial expression, and enough legal text to ruin somebody's quarterly earnings. And that matters because China doesn't usually lose ground this way in Europe. Not with tanks, not with frigates, not with dramatic speeches, with infrastructure, standards, procurement, networks, the quiet systems underneath modern power. Who builds them, who maintains them, who gets access, who gets frozen out. That's where this part of the story starts. So back in 2020, Sweden's telecom regulator banned Huawei and ZTE from key parts of the country's 5G networks, following input from the Swedish Armed Forces and the security service. It was not just a symbolic warning. Operators were also told to remove existing Huawei and ZTE gear from core functions by January 1st, 2025. Huawei challenged the decision in court and lost. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a technical dispute, a telecom story, the sort of thing normal people skip because it contains the words network architecture and spectrum auction, which is usually a reliable sign that your uncle has fallen asleep in his chair. But strategically, it was much bigger than that, because when Sweden made that decision, it did two things at once. First, it told China that access to Swedish critical infrastructure was not automatic. Second, it told the rest of Europe that a country didn't need to be massive to say no to Beijing's tech footprint. And that second part is where the irritation really starts. Because China has spent years trying to embed itself into global systems through technology, supply chains, telecom equipment, industrial investment, and market dependence. That's influence with a power cable attached. Not flashy, not always visible, but very real. And Sweden stepped right into that process and jammed a stick in the gears. The message wasn't subtle. Sweden's security authorities looked at the risk picture and concluded that this wasn't just about cheaper equipment or faster rollout. It was about trust, about control, about whether the backbone of a national network should be built with hardware tied to a state that Western intelligence agencies have spent years worrying about. And Sweden answered that question in the most Swedish way imaginable. Not with shouting, with regulation, not with ideology, with compliance language so dry it could dehydrate a lake. Basically, tack, mene tack, thank you, but absolutely not. And Beijing noticed, because Chinese officials publicly urged Sweden to correct the mistake and warned that the decision could affect trade relations. That was the giveaway. If this were merely a commercial disagreement, it would have stayed commercial. Instead, it became political almost immediately. Now, here's where the story gets more interesting, because Sweden is not just any European country in telecoms. It's home to Ericsson, which creates a genuinely awkward little paradox. On one side, Stockholm blocks Huawei and ZTE from Swedish 5G networks on national security grounds. On the other side, Ericsson still does business in China. So Sweden is simultaneously telling Beijing, we do not want your telecom gear in our critical systems, while one of Sweden's biggest industrial champions is still trying to sell telecom gear inside China. That is not a contradiction exactly, but it is tension, real tension, because security logic and commercial logic are not the same thing. Governments think in vulnerabilities, companies think in market share. Governments ask, can this system be trusted in a crisis? Companies ask, can we still win contracts next quarter? And for a while, Ericsson tried to hold that line. After Sweden's Huawei ban, Ericsson's position in China became more politically sensitive. Reuters reported that Ericsson's share of revenue from China fell sharply over time, and in 2022 noted the company had already faced backlash there after Sweden's restrictions on Huawei. So now Sweden finds itself in a very strange position. Militarily, it has moved closer to the Western alliance system. Technologically, it has taken one of the clearest anti-Huawei positions in Europe. Economically, one of its flagship companies still has to survive in a market controlled by the same state Sweden is strategically pushing back against. That is not a clean line. That is a balancing act. And balancing acts get dangerous when both sides start moving. Because by late 2025, reports said China had tightened scrutiny on Nokia and Ericsson contracts, forcing them into opaque national security reviews, the so-called black box checks that slowed business and gave local competitors an advantage. Reuters, citing the Financial Times, reported that China was curbing the use of Nokia and Ericsson gear in telecom networks through this tougher review process. So this is no longer just Sweden punishing Huawei. It's China answering back, quietly, administratively, systemically. Funny how that works. Everybody becomes a believer in technical standards once geopolitics shows up with a knife. And that's why this section of the story matters so much. Because it shows that Sweden's enemies, or let's say Sweden's increasingly annoyed strategic competitors, are not dealing with one problem. They're dealing with two. The first Sweden problem is military: Gotland, NATO, the Baltic, airfields, submarines, sensors, long-range fires. The second Sweden problem is institutional: a Western democracy with credible industry, advanced networks, strong security services, and enough confidence to say no to Chinese infrastructure penetration, even when that creates commercial pain at home. That combination is nasty, because it means Sweden is difficult in both war planning and peacetime competition. Hard to pressure militarily, hard to influence quietly. And that's usually the sweet spot for states like Russia and China. They prefer countries that are exposed in one way or the other, either militarily weak or economically pliable. Sweden is becoming neither. At least that's the direction, and that at least matters, because this is the point in the script where it would be easy to overdo it and pretend Stockholm has solved everything. It hasn't. There's still a real vulnerability here. Ericsson still matters, China still matters, trade exposure still matters, and no serious country gets to sever every economic link overnight just because the strategic weather turns ugly. That's fantasy. Real states carry contradictions. Sweden certainly does. And the more openly Sweden pushes back against Russian military pressure and Chinese tech influence, the harder it becomes to keep its commercial exposure neatly separated from its strategic choices. That separation starts to break down, slowly at first, then all at once. Which brings us to the next part of the story. Because if the beginning was about Russia losing space in the Baltic, and after was about China losing space in Sweden's networks, then this last part is where the map gets really uncomfortable. Because Sweden is not standing alone anymore. It's standing next to Finland. And for Moscow, that is where the headache turns into a wall. A very cold, very organized, very heavily armed Nordic wall. One side gives NATO submarines, Gripens, Gotland, and a defense industry everyone suddenly wants to buy from. The other side gives NATO 1,300 kilometers of border with Russia and a population that treats national emergency planning the way other people treat gardening. Sweden used to be the elegant neutral neighbor. Finland used to be the neighbor who quietly stacked firewood, stored ammunition, and assumed history would eventually get weird again. Now they're both in NATO, and Russia has to look at that every morning. While most of Europe relaxed after the Cold War, Finland didn't. It dug in, stockpiled, prepared for the worst like it was just another Tuesday. And if something happens, Finland doesn't ramp up. It activates hundreds of thousands of reservists, massive artillery, a border that doesn't just exist, it pushes back. There's a quiet rivalry in that partnership. Sweden builds the systems, Finland builds the backup plan for when everything breaks. Together, they don't leave much space, and with Gotland already locked down, that space is shrinking even faster. Russian movement in the Baltic isn't just seen anymore, it's expected. But while the military side tightens, the economic side doesn't. Because Sweden's toughest move wasn't joining NATO, it was saying no to China. And that decision still comes with a price. Ericsson is still tied to that system. Not enough to control Sweden, but enough to matter. Enough that pressure doesn't stay theoretical. So now Sweden sits in a position it hasn't been in for centuries. Not neutral, not invisible, but exposed. A frontline NATO power, with economic links pulling in the opposite direction. And that balance doesn't last forever. At some point, those pressures meet. And when they do, it won't be about maps anymore. It'll be about cost. Because Sweden isn't sitting on the sidelines anymore. It's standing in the middle of it, as a gate. And gates don't get ignored, they get tested. The only question is when. And when that moment comes, Sweden's enemies probably won't like it. But then again, neither will Finland. Because if there's one country that's always treated Sweden like a friendly rival, it's the one already standing next to it. Calm, prepared, and quietly wondering why Sweden needed 200 years to catch up.